hand over to Rob.
Thanks very much,
Thank you.
Derek. Very kind. I'm just going to go to the share screen. So I hope you can all see the slides. So thanks very much for inviting me to speak. It's a great pleasure. And I'm going to try and make a long story short, but there's a lot of pictures to get through. Very, very little text for you to have to read. I'm going to talk about the Boer War and particularly the campaign to relieve Ladysmith. And for this audience, I'm going to try to concentrate a little bit on the firearms aspects of the campaign. Several people have given me pictures, particularly Neville Constantine, but also Arnold van Dijk and Tinus LaRue. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's contributed to me. So in 1896, which is before the Boer War, there were two kind of technological breakthroughs. The first was the automatic pistol, the C96, and the second was the Brownie box camera. And of those, the Brownie box camera undoubtedly contributed more to our understanding of the Boer War. And the reason is because British officers almost invariably would carry a camera with them, and they photographed everything they could. There was no idea of censorship, either of the visual image or of letters at that stage. So there's very, very frank photography and very, very frank letters and diaries from the time, much franker than are seen from the Great War and the Second World War. The other thing of 1896 was of course, the Boer Mauser rifle, which this talk will largely be centered around. But if you look at officers' photograph albums, of which this is an absolutely typical example, they're incredibly dull. They show this kind of picture taken with a Brownie box camera. And so what you find when you look at these albums, of which there are many, many examples, that they all seem to have in common that they've spiced up their album with photographs of Spioenkop dead. This is the most famous photograph of the war, and it's a copy of a copy of a copy. This is another album from another officer, again showing the Spioenkop dead. Now, neither of these officers had been anywhere near Spioenkop, but this became a kind of cliche that these photographs would be bought and put into your album. This is yet another album in which exactly the same thing is seen, and you'll see this time after time when you're doing archival research. These photographs were not Brownie box pictures. They were taken by the guy on the right, whose name is Jan van Hoepen. He's seen here with his son. And he traveled the Boer lines with a tripod camera, taking photographs of anything he found interesting. And he was a very good photographer. And his photographs, taken for propaganda purposes, have become incredibly well known. And it's for those reasons that Spioenkop has the reputation it has. It's really based on the fact that the British public were shocked to see the photographs. They'd never seen anything like it. And Spioenkop then becomes something of an image in their mind, which is instantly recognizable. It's on the par with Isandlwana or Rorke's-Drift or Majuba, mainly because of those famous photographs, which I'll show you again at the end. Those photographs really put the end to this kind of illustration. This is by Caton Woodville. Up to Spioenkop, this was the way that the Boer War and all British imperial wars had been understood. But after the Spioenkop photographs came out, this sort of imagery disappeared almost instantly. People wouldn't accept it as having any relevance at all. And also following Spioenkop, people wanted eyewitness accounts. So you find these lurid, gruesome descriptions of battle coming out for the first time by private soldiers as well as officers. Everyone claimed to have been at Spioenkop. Winston Churchill here in his tent in Natal claimed to have been on Spioenkop. He actually was close to the summit on 2 occasions, but he never ventured onto the summit itself. Mahatma Gandhi, who was a stretcher bearer, claimed to have been on Spioenkop in his autobiography, which is called Adventures with the Truth, but it wasn't true at all. He'd in fact been no closer than about 5 kilometers to Spioenkop, and none of his stretcher bearers were actually in the firing line, although he claimed they were. I'm just trying to advance the slide. Oh, there we are. And this is an example of a Boer claiming to be at Spioenkop. This is Burger Edward Wertheim's application for the service medal. He puts on the right the battles he's fought in: Elandswachter, Nicholson's, Colenso, Spioenkop, Valkrans, and Pietershoogte. Now, he was with the Johannesburg Commando, and almost certainly he was near Spioenkop, but not on Spioenkop. But well over half the Boers who fought in Natal claimed to have been at Spioenkop, even though probably only 300 Boers actually participated on the summit itself. Now, just to go back to the fundamentals of the war, you'll know that prior to the outbreak of the Boer War, Britain controlled the areas illustrated here in pink. And the Transvaal and the Orange Free State were two Boer republics in the center of this. And the Transvaal had become extremely wealthy due to the discovery of gold. It was the most expensive real estate on the planet. And in 1896, on New Year's Eve, 1895, 1896, the British supporters sent a raid in from Bechuanaland, known as the Jameson Raid, to try and provoke an uprising in Johannesburg. And the raid failed. But the very next day, which was New Year's Day, 1896, the Commandant General began to order Mausers. And over the next 3 years, the Transvaal spent 30% of its revenue on armaments and bought the most up-to-date small arms and artillery that it could find. And as I said, it had plenty of money to spend. The Boers didn't have an army. This shows what's called a Kriegsraad, or a council of war, before the Battle of Colenso. It shows the officers crouching under thorn trees, discussing the plan of battle. The burghers would vote for their officers. They weren't paid. They fought entirely as volunteers. They had no military training at all. But every male between the ages of 18 and 60 was called up by the commandant to join a commando. And whether they participated in the battle or not was a question of whether they wanted to, but they did have to serve. And so you find this remarkable situation where people with no military training, but with very good rifles, were able to hold off the British Army for 3 years. And this is the Boer Mauser in action. I want you to notice, you'll know this probably instinctively, but that there's no flash and no smoke whatsoever, that it's clip loaded, and that the rate of fire is pretty good. So that's 6 shots in 20 seconds. And the point is that any Boer could do this and could keep this up indefinitely, as long as there was ammunition, and would be completely unseen. So when the war broke out, the Boer commandos invaded Natal to try and get an advantage before the reinforcements inevitably would come from overseas. And they wanted to invade as quickly as possible, try and take Natal and Durban before reinforcements came. But very shrewdly, the British got themselves besieged in Ladysmith, thereby anchoring the Boer army around Ladysmith. And similar sieges took place at Kimberley and Mafeking in the west. But of course, then the campaign then switched to the attempt to relieve Ladysmith. There were about 12,500 soldiers trapped in Ladysmith and a similar number of civilians. And very quickly, they started to get ill with typhoid, enteric fever. So this shows the situation in Natal at the 15th of December at the Battle of Colenso. At the top, you've got Ladysmith, and you can see the defensive line of the British at the top. And then further out, you'll see the attacking line of the Boers. And this was a static situation from the 2nd of November until the end of February. And most of the Boers in Natal were pinned down in the attacking line in a stationary situation, completely contrary to their nature. And the railway line, which is coming up from the south through Frere and Chieveley towards Colenso, that's where the British reinforcements made their way up from Durban. between the British and the Boers is the Tugela River, which you'll see snaking its way from left to right in the picture. And the British, of course, would have to cross the Tugela River by a pontoon because all of the bridges had been blown. And in order to get to Ladysmith, they'd have to cross the Tugela River, they'd have to cross the high ground on the far side of the Tugela River, and then make their way through to Ladysmith. And to relieve Ladysmith had enormous political significance to the empire. Everyone was watching the fate of Ladysmith and the other towns on a daily basis in their newspapers. It was a source of extreme national pride that this relief should take place before the garrison had to surrender, or they all died due to disease. So the first clash is on the 15th of December, 1899, when General Buller's army first came up against the Boers in an attempt to come straight up the railway line. So this is the Battle of Colenso. I'm going to tell you very little about it, except that they came up the railway line from the south, and they attacked on the left and on the right of the railway line. On the left, General Hart with the Irish Brigade went into that loop in the river you can see there. And the Boers were entrenched and unseen on the far side of the river and opened fire at about 1,000 meters. And within a matter of minutes, there were 216 casualties in the leading battalion of the Dublin Fusiliers of 900 men. So they had 25% casualties in about 10 minutes from rifle fire. And on the right of the railway line, there was a problem with the artillery, which I'll tell you next. So this shows the Tugela River. This is just after the battle, the Tugela River running away from us in this picture. On the right is the flat ground where General Hart's men were. And on the left, you can see a trench. This would have had the Standerton commander in this trench. From the British side, this is what it looked like. This is actually a photograph taken during the battle, shows men waiting to advance with the high ground in the distance. And you'll now become aware of this huge open plains that characterize Natal. There's not a tree in sight. Well, there's one tree in sight, but no cover, and the distances involved are enormous. And the British were coming under fire at 1,000 meters or thereabouts with devastating effect. This shows an Irishman being bandaged behind the scenes at Colenso. And this shows another casualty of Colenso who's been shot through the chest. And the extraordinary thing the British found was that these wounds, these long-range wounds, seemed to be extremely trivial. Less than 1 in 7 men who'd been shot through the chest would die. And at this distance, there was a very small entrance and a very small exit wound. To the right of the railway line, the artillery unlimbered within about 1,000 meters of the river, which was far too close. And they came under fire, and 2 batteries of guns, the 66th and the 14th battery of field artillery, were cut down by rifle fire very, very quickly. 2 heroic men, Lieutenant Freddie Roberts and Captain Walter Congreve, both made an attempt to rescue the field guns, and they were both hit 3 times. Freddie Roberts died, and they each got the Victoria Cross. But the point is, each man was hit 3 times at 1,000 meters, just while trying to gallop towards the guns over perhaps 500 meters of exposed ground. This is Frederick Treves, the famous surgeon who looked after the Elephant Man. He was called to operate on Freddie Roberts, but found the situation he was too far gone to operate on. But in the weekly column in the British Medical Journal, Frederick Treves would describe his patients by name with their wounds and what he'd done and so on. General Woodgate was described, Freddie Roberts was described, and there seemed to be no idea of censorship or anonymity at all in those days. It was extremely frank. This is a pose picture, again taken by our photographer Jan van Hoepen, but it's taken at the time of the Battle of Colenso, probably during a lull in the battle. The men have been grouped together for the picture. But what's interesting about this group of Boers is, firstly, they're shooting a combination of mixture of Mausers, and the one in the front shooting a Lee Metford Mark II. But it's the sight settings that I want you to look at. The Boer on the left, his sights was at 2,000 meters. I'll try and go back and show you that again. If you look on the left, you'll see his sight setting. And then just to the right of the standing man, there's another Boer, his sight set to about 1,800 meters. It's extraordinarily long range for infantry to be engaged. And if you look at the chap in the middle now, he's using the long range volley sight. And you can see from the setting that he's set at about the same, at about 2,000 meters. Now, the cartridges that one finds on the battlefield are almost invariably the two that are in the box. It is 7x57 and 7x53 Mauser ammunition. Although the Geddes on the extreme left, you do find those cartridges in trenches. They are scarce. I've never found a Martini Henry cartridge case on a Natal Boer War battlefield. Because they gave off a huge pool of white smoke and were never allowed to fire from the trenches, which were completely concealed. And on the extreme right is the Krag, which of course was used in very small numbers, and I've never found one in Natal. What you do find on the battlefields around the Tugela are very large numbers of fired 303 bullets and Mauser bullets, and they're almost entirely undeformed. You could reload with these. I would reckon they're that intact. They've obviously struck the ground at very, very long range. The exception are the two Mauser bullets on the bottom, on the right, which have mushroomed slightly from obviously hitting a rock. Then on the right of the picture, you tend to find fired Boer Mauser cases in fairly large quantities, and quite a lot of fired and unfired 303. The British seem to drop a huge amount of ammunition and not pick it up. It's very unusual to find live Mauser ammunition. This shows the Boer Mauser rifle and carbine in use. This is the Middelburg Commando, 5 men of the Middelburg Commando, sorry, 6. And this is on the Natal front. You can see the one in the middle kneeling has got a carbine. There were 7,000 carbines. The others are carrying the long rifle, for which there were 30,000 for the Transvaal and 8,000 for the Free State. So they're rare rifles compared to 303s. And many HBSA members have them and shoot them and enjoy them. In some pictures, you'll see men carrying 303s as well, but after the fall of Pretoria in June, 303s became more and more the rifle that the Boers used because they couldn't resupply their commandos with Mauser ammunition. And you'll also see an 8mm Geddes single shot, this young lad on the left of the pictures using, and those definitely were used in Natal. They had smokeless ammunition and black powder ammunition, and it's the smokeless ammunition that was allowed in the trenches. The British had a range of 303s. At the bottom, you find the Lee Enfield and Lee Metford carbine. And then the next one up is the Lee Enfield Mark I, and above it, the Lee Metford Mark II, and at the top, the Lee Metford Mark I Star. And battlefield pickups in Natal are mainly Metford rifles. About 3/4 of the 303 heads that you pick up are Metford rifles. The Natal volunteers, like Thornycroft's Mounted Infantry, used the Martini Enfield, which has got the same barrel and sights as the Lee Enfield. The experience of wounds produced by Mauser ammunition was extremely fascinating to the British medical profession, and weekly columns came out in the British Medical Journal and the Lancet talking about the wounds. And books came out as well. This one by the head of the College of Surgeons, a clinical study of the nature and effects of injuries produced by bullets of small caliber. There were some bizarre experiments carried out. This one to look at what would happen if you fired through a skull with a Mauser Mark II Cordite 303 or a dum-dum bullet. Things we take for granted now were fascinating new discoveries for the medical profession at the time. And they were widely discussed, and people were startled to see that at close range, the Mauser would produce a much, much bigger wound, and they kept wondering if the Boers were using dum-dums, but actually it's just the hydraulic shock of high velocity jacketed bullet at short range. Makins, who wrote that book, considered that a lot of the large wounds that were seen were not caused by dum-dums, which everyone was worried about the other side using, but were caused by ricochets. And he illustrates the types of ricochets he's removed from wounds. There are exceptions. These three cartridges, these are 303 cartridges, which were removed from the pocket of a buried man, a Boer, called Van Niekerk, from the Ermelo commander. He was disinterred in 1978 and reinterred in the Boer Memorial, and had these homemade dum-dum cartridges in his pocket. So to a small extent, there was the use of expanding ammunition, though everyone was very worried that the other side was using it extensively. So after the defeat at Colenso, there was a kind of a stalemate where the British withdrew back to Chivali on the railway line and Freya, and waited for even more reinforcements to come, which they did. And on the 9th of January, reinforcements finally came up the railway line, and the British were then ready to make another attempt to relieve Ladysmith. Meanwhile, there'd been an attack by the Boers to try to take Ladysmith by assault. And of course, with modern weapons, the advantage is very, very much on the side of the defenders, and that attempt to take Ladysmith on the 6th of January failed. But what was notable was that one of the casualties was Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cunningham, VC, who was the commander of the Gordon Highlanders. And he was hit by a bullet fired from 2.9 kilometers away. And it went through his back, and he died the following day. And so when we talk about long-range casualties, I mean, he was hit by a stray bullet, but it is absolutely astonishing the extent to which the Mauser bullet and the 303 will carry and kill if you're unlucky. But the main cause of mortality in Ladysmith was typhoid. And remember, I said there were 12,500 soldiers and 12,500 civilians, more or less. By the end of the siege, about 10,500 people had been admitted to the hospital with typhoid, and a large number, over 550 soldiers, had died of typhoid. So the reason to relieve Ladysmith was really to stop everyone from dying of disease before they got there. So Buller, having attempted to break through at Colenso and having failed, decided to march about 25 miles upstream, where there were a series of drifts crossing the Tugela River. So on the 10th of January, the columns set off going to the west. The two columns met and then divided again to cross at two different drifts, Trichart's drift on the left and Potgieter's drift on the right. And this column moving west traveled about 1 mile an hour, because they were all their transport was on ox wagons, very slow moving. And the Boers just mimicked their passage west with the movements of their own, and all the reinforcements that they could were taken away from the attacking line at Ladysmith. By this stage, the defenders of Ladysmith were so weak, they were unable to undertake any offensive action. And so the Boers could withdraw a large number of burghers from their lines to go upstream to match the westward movement of the British. This shows one of many photographs taken of the columns beginning to move out of Freya camp. You can see in the front an ox wagon, and in the back a column of infantry, and behind it, stretching away, you can see more and more infantry, and behind that more and more ox wagons. There were altogether about 350 ox wagons and about 3,000 oxen. And they couldn't really move away from the road. The road wasn't particularly good, but they couldn't go across country with wheeled transport. Whereas the Boers were highly mobile on their horses and could really move wherever the threat came much, much quicker than the British were able to. And the British knew this. They knew that mobility was the big problem. As well as the men moving upstream, both sides, the Boers and the British, unspooled telegraph wires to link the commandos upstream with their headquarters, and from there to Pretoria or London. So telephone and Morse code communication was happening in instantaneous time from the front line to Pretoria and to London. So we now have the British Army having moved upstream, having left quite a lot of men behind to protect the lines of communication all the way back to Durban. So the force available to attack Ladysmith is getting smaller and smaller. But nonetheless, there were 15,000 infantry on the river and about 2,500 mounted men, as well as a large number of field artillery. General Buller, you see him in the distance with his telescope, surveyed the Boer defenses across Potgietersdrift from the slopes of Spearman's Hill. What he saw is captured on this sketch map by Lieutenant Harvey of the Medical Corps. You see this Tugela River snaking across from left to right. You can see in the foreground the contours of the British-held heights, which General Buller's on. And then you see the dotted lines indicating Boer trenches. There's trench after trench after trench all the way back. Louis Botha, who was the commander-in-chief of the Boers, said their secret weapon in Natal was the spade. Now, you wouldn't expect a highly mobile force like the Boers to take to trench warfare, but this is exactly what happened. This is a picture showing the Boer side of the Tugela River, and if you look behind the standing man, you can see the trench snaking off into the distance. It wasn't continuous trench works. They were normally ran for about 25 meters, and then there would be a break, and then another trench section, and then a break, and so on. And they were concealed so they weren't up against the skyline and couldn't be seen as trenches from the attacking force. The British brought with them a hydrogen balloon, as well as hydrochloric acid and zinc, as well as cylinders of hydrogen to refill it with gas. And they launched the balloon to try and look down onto the Boer trenches from about 2 kilometers away. And Major Phillips, who was in the balloon, was hit in the head by a Mauser bullet. It didn't kill him, but it grazed him. And the balloon was so perforated with Mauser bullets that it actually began to lose gas, and it wasn't actually able to ascend very high thereafter. So again, an illustration of very accurate shooting at 2,000 meters and 200 feet up. So General Buller, having said, well, Potgietersdrift is too heavily defended in front of me, I'm going to ask General Warren on the left to cross at Trichardsdrift with about 2/3 of the men and to try and go around the Boer flank and get to Ladysmith that way. They took with them pontoon bridges to build a bridge as they went. And as they were going down to the bridge to start building this, 4 Boers opened fire from Wright's farm across the river, and the entire army ground to a halt, and 2 men were killed at a distance of 2 kilometers. They had to bring up the artillery and shell those 4 Boers out of the farmhouse. And that lesson wasn't lost on anyone there. The idea that concealed riflemen with smokeless ammunition could really bring an army to a halt if the army was in the open. But the bridge was completed. There was very little opposition because the Boers were trying to draw the British away from the river. They needed water, so they wanted them away from the river, and they wanted them within 2,000 meters of the trenches that they were busy digging in front of Trichardsdrift. The British suffered very badly from the lack of a map. They had a blueprint map called the Blue Map, which General Buller had compiled from farm boundaries in Pietermaritzburg. This is an example of the Blue Map which survives. The problem with it is that it doesn't have a grid. It doesn't have an X and Y axis to tell you where you are. It doesn't have a scale, and it doesn't show contours. There's kind of artist's impression of high ground, but it's absolutely useless when it comes to finding your way around the land. And some prominent things like Spioenkop is in the wrong place entirely. It's about 2.5 kilometers away from where it should be. So you find Spioenkop here, the name Spioenkop in the middle of the slide. That's not Spioenkop at all. Spioenkop is 2.5 kilometers west of there. So they had this absolutely useless map, and so then no one knew where they were at all. And they just got lost almost immediately. On the Boer side, they had a very capable commander-in-chief in the form of Louis Botha. He was just turned 37 years old. He was a farmer. He had military experience, but no military training. But he was an extremely encouraging and charismatic man. Here's another picture of him from the same photo shoot. And his tactic was not to open fire until the British were within range, which he considered to be 2,000 meters, and then to fire from concealed trenches. There was a mounted brigade under Lord Dundonald, which decided to wade across before the pontoon bridge was completed and immediately made their way off to the left. This shows the mounted brigade just after they've crossed the Tugela River. So on the 17th of January, the mounted brigade was across and began to probe west to try and get around what they hoped would be around the Boer lines. And on the 18th of January, Duncan Mackenzie, who was commanding a troop of the Natal Carbineers, spotted a Boer commando coming down the road towards the Free State. So if you look at this map, you'll see the Tugela River at the bottom. The Boers are in green, as in all the maps, the Boers are in green and the British are in red or pink. And this commando of about 300 men under Daniel Opperman and Nicolaas Mentz were making their way down the road to the Orange Free State. They thought the British were well over to the east. They had no idea there were British that close. And Duncan Mackenzie got permission to take 80 men, 40 Imperial Light Horse and 40 Natal Carbineers, and set a trap for them on the Acton Holmes Road. This shows a kind of partial bird's eye view of what happened. Mackenzie galloping in from the right at the bottom in dotted lines, taking up position on these two low hills, and down the road towards him comes Daniel Opperman's 300-strong commando. In the distance there's a Boer field gun, and on the right you'll see the two prominent high ground called Bastion Hill and Tabanyama, both still in Boer hands. The British opened fire and the Boers galloped away. A group of about 80 took refuge on this little knoll, including Commandant Mentz himself. And after they ran out of ammunition, they had to surrender. So this was the first British victory in Natal. They captured about 25 prisoners and killed about 18 Boers, and considered to be a great success. And it's been a kind of myth ever since that Dundonald had captured the road to Ladysmith and General Warren was too sluggish to follow up, and this led to the disaster at Spioenkop. But it's not true at all. Just as a digression, Veldkornet Mentz was disinterred again in 1978 and buried in the Boer Memorial. This shows his grave being opened on the left. And as a matter of interest, you'll see that his remains were covered by a sheet of corrugated roofing iron. Boers were generally buried underneath corrugated iron in order to discourage burrowing animals. These shows the Boer prisoners from the Acton Holmes Road engagement being marched into captivity. They were very well treated. But the illustrations of the time show the engagement taking place in high ground. You'll remember from the photograph you've seen how low everything is, but this is the kind of eyewitness sketch, if you like, which became a painting in the with the flag to Pretoria, and it's completely misleading. Equally misleading is the Times history of the war, which shows the engagement having taken place up here on the left of the thing, where they've almost got round the Boer lines. If you look on this map, you'll see the Boer lines being a green dotted line across, sort of left to right across the high ground. So if the Times history was to be believed, this was a major, major victory that Dundonald's mounted brigade had done. But when you do battlefield archaeology, you find the actual battle took place 7 kilometers away. And remember, Ladysmith is off to the northeast, and this battle took place 7 kilometers to the southwest. And it had absolutely no strategic value at all. But because no historians have really visited the site, this has been a myth that's been perpetuated. So by the evening of January the 18th, you've got Dundonald in the top left on the road, miles away, completely out of sight. He's about 10 kilometers away from the infantry. And the fear that all British commanders had, they had two fears. The one was of being cut off, because every time until then, a force had been cut off by the Boers, they'd had to surrender. And the other fear they had was of a night attack. They thought that those were the two things that would really terrified every British commander. So General Warren, who did his best thereafter to try to link up with Dundonald, set off the next, here's General Warren with his staff, General Charles Warren seated in the center. He set off the next day to try to link up with Dundonald's mounted force, and they got a maximum of about 3 miles. They made very, very slow progress. They set off before dawn, and by late afternoon, they'd only got that far, and they decided it was absolutely futile. There's no road. They couldn't take the ox wagons cross country. If they got any closer to the high ground, they'd have been within rifle range, and they felt this was moving west to try and get around the Boers was never going to happen. The Boers would just extend their lines westwards. So there was no alternative but a frontal attack on the Boer lines. This shows the Royal Lancasters crossing Venterspreit on that failed, futile march west. What's interesting about this picture is they carry a mixture of Lee Metfords and Lee Enfields within a single unit. So this shows the high ground of what's known as Tabanyama. Tabanyama means Black Mountain in Zulu, and it's the high ground west of Spioenkop, which is where the British now had to make a frontal assault. So we're going to look from west to east along this. I'll just get that up again. Looking from west to east. This is all the British could see, and their map couldn't reveal anything more than what they could see. And the problem is from here, you can't get any idea of what lies behind this false crest. And what lies behind it is about 1 to 2 kilometers of grassland. It's exactly like shooting on Stickledown. If you're in the Boer trenches at the back of Tabanyama, you look down over grassland with no cover at all to that crest which the British could see. So Tabanyama, which is the high ground at the top of this map, is divided by the Boers into 2 sections: Langkop or Long Hill running left to right, and then Platkop or Flat Hill on the left there. And the Boers were digging trenches furiously where the green triangles are indicated. The British decided to try and take the high ground sequentially from east to west. And they started by going up what's called Spur 1. General Woodgate took his men up Spur 1 before dawn and captured without opposition at all several high ground prominences, Three Tree Hill, Picket Hill, and Connaught Hill. So by dawn, the high ground on Spur 1 had been taken, and the Boer line is about 1,500 to 2,000 meters further up. But at this stage, the Boers remained silent. The artillery came into action. This shows a 15-pounder coming to action on the Ladysmith Road. And this shows exactly the same spot today. And that's the Ladysmith Road you see going away from you there. That's the road the wagons would have to use to get across to Ladysmith. And the high ground in front of you is called Green Hill. The 15-pounders were put onto Three Tree Hill, 6 batteries of 15-pounders, that's 36 guns, and they began to shell the Boer lines, or where they imagined the Boer lines to be, in order to imagine the rest of the infantry to take spurs 2, 3, 4, and 5. This shows the same scene today. These are, as far as I can tell, these are the 15-pounder gun positions. I've put white paint on a boulder on each of the gun positions. This is gun 6 in the middle of this picture and gun 5 on the right, and so on. The guns were about 10 meters apart. You can tell it's a gun position because in the ground you'll find a T-friction tube, which is the ignition mechanism for the bag of cordite which fires the gun. So if you find a cluster of these in the ground behind a crescentic wall, that's an artillery position. And this shows Three Tree Hill Royal Artillery officers having a chat. In the background, you can see a limber coming up to bring ammunition onto Three Tree Hill. And the skyline behind them is Spioenkop. This is Burger Roland Schikkeling. He wrote a fantastic book. He was with the Pretoria Commando, and like a lot of Boers, he said he wasn't going to cut his hair until there was peace. This shows him at the end of the war. He still hasn't had his hair cut. But he famously said that in the jurisdiction of the rifle, the artillery does not have the deciding voice. And that's the problem about the artillery, was that they would unlimber within sight of the enemy, and therefore within range of the enemy if the enemy could shoot at long range. And when you look in the ground around these artillery positions, you'll find many, many Mauser bullets in the ground. So these guys were under rifle fire continually. To be within shrapnel range, you also had to be within rifle range. So under the cover of artillery fire from Three Tree Hill, the Irish Brigade then took Spur 2, coming under intense fire when they got to within about 1.5 kilometers of the trench. And this is a photograph from that day, which shows the Border Regiment firing. You'll notice they removed their Foreign Service helmets because the brim in front, it comes down very low if you're firing prone. If you're standing up, it's fine. But if you want to try and fire prone, the brim at the back pushes up on the nape of your neck, and it pushes the brim in the front even further down. So men actually either took their helmets off in combat or they reversed them, and you'll see helmets on backwards if they are actually action photographs. The Boers had spent several days digging these enormous trenches. And you'll notice here they're working with big crowbars to move boulders around. There's African and white people involved in digging these trenches, and there were huge stone parapets behind which are deep slit trenches. This shows soon after the battle the parapet of a Boer trench, and in the background that's Spioenkop. This is looking at Green Hill. And this is exactly the same scene today. These trenches are everywhere and very, very easy to understand and to find. The trench itself would be neck deep, as narrow as possible. As I've said, discontinuous, often about 10 to 25 meters in length. Each man was told to dig 3 meters of trench, 1 meter for himself and 1 for someone else, and then a third one just in case. But in general, they try to dig even more than 3 meters per person. So these trenches, there were about 4,000 Boers on this Tabanyama. These trenches went on for kilometer after kilometer. And then on the reverse slope of Tabanyama, where there's a kind of, under the trajectory of the shells and bullets, they dug these shelter trenches. You'll see this isn't really a trench, it's just a shelter with sandbags on the roof. The sandbags are to stop strays from coming through the corrugated iron. So some men would be in the fighting trench on the front slope, and the others would be having a break on the reverse slope while the British bombardment was continuing. The Boers also had their own artillery coming into action, but they didn't work in batteries. They were deployed singly, and they used forward artillery observers with heliographs to direct the fire. And this is Lieutenant Heinrich Grothaus, a German artilleryman. There were several very prominent German artillerymen on this campaign. You'll see in front of this Krupp 75mm gun, they've put a tarpaulin over the defensive wall. This is to stop dust from flying up when the gun is fired and revealing the position. These guns also fired smokeless ammunition, so there was no flash or smoke to reveal the position of Boer guns. As well as the 75mm Krupps and Crusoe guns, the Boers also had 2 pom-poms. These are 37mm Max and Nordenfeldt, like a huge oversized Vickers. And they would fire strings of 3 or 5 shells, which were subsonic, so that the infantry receiving the fire could actually hear the gun and take cover, if there was cover, before the shells arrived. But of course, on Spioenkop, where they were used to devastating effect, there was no cover at all. So by the afternoon of the 20th of January, the British had taken spurs 1 and 2 and 3, looking from right to left, and then Dundonald's Mounted Brigade decided to do a throw in their hand. They'd moved east from their extended position on Acton Holmes Road to participate in this, and they helped take Bastion Hill, which is also called Spur 5. And this is notable because this is the action that Winston Churchill himself participated in very bravely. Winston Churchill brought up these Colt 303 Colt machine guns and was involved in the capture of Bastion Hill. This shows Winston Churchill in the uniform of the South African Light Horse. Trooper Tobin of the South African Light Horse was the first on top of Bastion Hill, but it turned out to be a futile victory because Bastion Hill itself was completely overlooked by Platkop, the flat hill back on Tabanyama. So the Boers had let it be taken without opposition. So by the afternoon of the 20th of January, the British were, as indicated, in all the red positions there, and the Boers in all the green positions. But if you look across to Platkop on the left, there'd been such intense shelling of Platkop that the Middelburg commando had actually fallen back, leaving a gap in the line. And there was a real danger that the British could break through there. So a great heroic action took place where three Boers named Slechtkamp, Hinden, and De Roos, these three men single-handedly went back up to Platkop. This is over on the left, top left of the screen. And the three men unfurled very prominently a flag, which you can see here. And while the flag was waving, they rushed about from boulder to boulder, firing as furiously as they could. And the British said they thought there were 500 men there. And they actually called off a bayonet charge up from Spur 2 because they thought that they'd be cut off by this commando on their left. And there was no commando, it was just these three men. It's almost difficult to believe it happened, except the fact that it was described, the action was described in detail by so many people. And they were heroes immediately thereafter. The next morning, Colonel Walter Kitchener decided to do something about this, and he decided to try and outflank the Boers, despite only being a colonel in charge of one battalion, the West Yorks. He brought 3 battalions into play because he was Horatio Kitchener's brother. He didn't have any criticism for this really bizarre suicidal attack, which he did on the morning of the 21st of January. What he was going to do was extremely complex. So in the plain below, where E and F are, these are 2 companies of the East Surreys. We're going to try and, before dawn, climb the slopes towards Platkop. Other companies of the East Surreys would work their way across Bastion Hill and across the isthmus of Bastion Hill. The West Surreys, the Queens, and the West Yorks would simultaneously attack in a frontal attack across the plain and take shelter in a donga, which is a ravine, which is halfway across. There was no possibility of artillery preparation, so he decided to use small arms preparation, something which had never been done before and which was never done again. This shows the starting line of the British for Kitchener's attack on the 21st of January. The stone wall shows their position, and in the distance is the flat ground they had to charge over. This shows men firing from that same stone wall during that day. The Queens managed to bring their Maxim gun up into the firing line to give fire support, small arms fire support. But the Maxims were on these heavy wheeled carriages rather than tripods, so they had very limited use in this campaign. And this shows the open ground that the infantry had to charge across. You can see running in the distance, running across the picture is this donga or ravine. It's a dry waterbed, or a dry watercourse. It's about 800 meters from the British line and about 800 meters from the top of Platkop. But no sooner did the British stand up to run towards it than they got shot down. It was very much a sort of forerunner of what would happen in the Great War. On Platkop itself today, you find a huge amount of evidence of the British attack in the forms of fired Boer cartridge cases, and the whole thing is covered with spent 303 bullets as well, showing the intensity of the battle. But by about 11 a.m., there'd been 100 casualties, and the senior staff called off Colonel Kitchener's attack as being a completely futile frontal attack on an entrenched position. Some of the British were buried in a mass grave, which is still there today. The other reason Kitchener's attack failed was because it was really impossible to coordinate the various elements of the attack. The only way of communicating on the battlefield was by runner. There was no way they could signal to each other, and the runners were exposed and didn't last long. So the problems of attacking on a very wide front without signals became very clear to them. So for the next 4 days, there was a static exchange of long-range fire between the British position and the Boer position. About 1.5 to 2 kilometers separate from each other, they were firing large volumes of rifle ammunition at each other for those 3 days, while the British were also trying to shell the Boers out of their trenches, but not succeeding. You see evidence of this phase of the battle in the form of tin openers and tins throughout the British lines. They didn't make cooking fires because they would have given their positions away. So they ate tinned food for these days. The British were using their long-range volley sights to shoot at the Boer lines to try to get to the lagers out of sight behind the high ground. They'd form groups of men which shoot for half an hour at a time, trying to drive the Boers out of their camps and lagers behind the high ground. And then on the 21st, they brought up high explosive artillery. These are 5-inch howitzers firing lyddite to try to blast the Boers out of the trenches. The problem was that the high explosive shell didn't seem to spread out when it hit. It seemed to burrow into the ground and just blow up and down vertically. So unless it was a direct hit, it had very little effect on the Boer trenches. At night, both sides would fire star shell. These are magnesium shells which would illuminate the battlefield. Both sides were terrified of a night attack. And of course, they had sentries awake and watching all night. And during the day, the long-range exchange of rifle fire. Again, you'll see these men with their sights elevated, helmets reversed so they can shoot firing prone. There were limited casualties on both sides, one of whom was this guy, Commandant Baron de Lange Badenhorst. He was the commandant of the Vryheid Commando. He was hit by a long-range 303 bullet. He hit in the forehead, and his death is described in great detail by his men in the book. He was buried on the farm Clydesdale, just behind Tabanyama in this picturesque setting, and he was exhumed in 1978. It can be seen that the bullet didn't penetrate his skull, but gave him a fracture of the skull and internal bleeding. He didn't die at once. He lay comatose for several hours before eventually dying. So now the Spioenkop. Why did Spioenkop have to be done? Well, Spioenkop is the high ground on the right of this picture. It's the key to the whole position because it can look down on Green Hill. From the top of Spioenkop, you can enfilade the trenches on Green Hill. You're higher than Green Hill and you're well within rifle range. There are no Boer trenches on Spioenkop, and the British didn't stop to ask why there were no Boer trenches on Spioenkop. But the reason was that it is impossible to dig a trench on Spioenkop because Spioenkop is made of stone. But General Warren decided he'd have to take Spioenkop, either that or withdraw back over the river and try elsewhere. So on the night of the 23rd of January, a column of 1,700 men was sent up Spioenkop at a night attack and occupied Spioenkop really without opposition on that night. This shows the high ground. This is from the British position on Tabanyama, showing the Boer position on Langkop, now looking to the east, Green Hill, and behind it, Spioenkop. And you can see the extent to which Spioenkop dominates the entire position. So there really was no alternative. If you were going to try and get through at that place, there was no alternative but to take Spioenkop. And this shows Thornycroft's mounted infantry, a very interesting photograph with their Martini Enfield rifles on their way towards Spioenkop. While the British were ascending Spioenkop, this is a column coming up at night. There was an extensive troop movement on Tabanyama as preparation for an attack on Green Hill, because Green Hill was clearly going to be the weak position. And very briefly, I'll tell you about Spioenkop, because I really don't want to go into detail about it. Spioenkop is this large whale-shaped hill, which is only one way up from the British side, which is the ascent spur you can see running from the right of the picture upwards. And this is where General Woodgate and his men climbed up in the middle of the night on the 23rd of January. There was just a small picket of Boers on Spioenkop itself. There were no entrenchments or defenses there at all. But the main position the British wanted to take was Conical Hill, which is the left-hand extension of Spioenkop, that little pimple sticking out to the left of Spioenkop. And from Conical Hill, they could overlook Green Hill, which is the other high ground on the horizon to the extreme left of the picture. The problem is Spioenkop on a summer morning is generally shrouded in mist, as it was that morning. And under the cover of the mist, the Boers could counterattack. The other problem, the other problem was that the British had dug a trench really on the top of the summit, where it gave no field of fire at all. So the counterattack couldn't really be stopped from the trench. This is the only combat picture which I think exists of Spioenkop itself. This shows the Scottish Rifles on the slopes of Spioenkop just waiting to attack the summit. The casualty rate on Spioenkop was absolutely enormous, and some soldiers were hit multiple times. This is Major Scott Moncrief's ankle, shot through by a bullet. He was hit 5 times. Once, then he fell and hit 4 times while on the ground. But he survived. This shows the summit of Spioenkop, and in the extreme brief account I'll give you shows what happened is that we're looking from the south to the north. The pimple at the top of Spioenkop is called Conical Hill, and that overlooks Green Hill to the left. Conical Hill I've labeled CH, Green Hill GH. The British dug a trench across the summit of Spioenkop, which you'll see there with the Royal Lancasters, South Lancashires, Thornycroft's mounted infantry, Lancashire Fusiliers occupying it. And the counterattack comes up from the Carolina Commando from the right of the picture. Under cover of the mist. By 8:30, the mist burns off, and then the British are pinned down by a circle of Boers on the perimeter, and by converging artillery fire of 5 field guns and 2 pom-poms. Huge casualties, as you know. This shows the shallowness and inadequacy of the British trench the next morning. There's our friend Jan van Hoepen, the photographer, a picture taken from another camera, showing how completely inadequate the trenches were on Spioenkop compared to the trenches you've seen the Boers having dug. This shows the same view today, with the trench now being used as a communal grave. And the inadequacy of the trenches can be seen in all the photographs that Van Hoepen took the next day. These are the photographs which became so famous and which have led to Spioenkop being so notorious. The Lancashire Fusiliers lying in their trench, and many men having died in the open. So that was the day of the 24th of January. The British lost 425 killed, and the Boers lost 25 men on Spioenkop itself. The British fought for another 2 days in exactly the same position they had before. The static trench warfare continued at this long range. And then on the 26th of January, and by the morning of the 27th of January, they withdrew over the Tugela. They tried 2 further attempts to relieve Ladysmith, and eventually, at the end of February, they broke through and relieved the city, relieved the town. And this shows Spioenkop in the evening sun. Well, I'd like to stop there. I hope I've given you a kind of a flavor for the Natal battles. I've tried to emphasize the sort of firearms aspects to some extent. It does come from, I'm plugging a book now, because I've written a book on this, which is going to come out towards the end of the year. And the book has got less firearms and more military history in it. But at this stage, I can stop and take questions.